Hello, welcome to the Restorative Justice in the Workplace webinar. This webinar is a part of our New Paradigm Leadership Educational Series brought to you by Workplace Peace Institute Leadership Academy. My name is Robin Short, and I am the CEO and founder of Workplace Peace Institute. In the organization, I work as an organization systems design consultant, leadership development trainer and coach. I work real specifically with people who are experiencing conflict as a mediator, peace builder, and restorative justice facilitator. I also work as an equity and belonging consultant, and ultimately my hope is that all the work that I do really supports individuals in actualizing and experiencing their human potential. Here at Workplace Peace Institute, our leadership development courses are designed to optimize competencies in human behavior, really specifically around communication skills, conflict resolution, diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, so that together as leaders we can create highly engaged workplaces where basic human needs and dignity needs are consistently honored. We believe that all of us are leaders. We all have the ability to actualize change in our specific sphere of influence. And so when we talk about leaders, we're really talking about all of us. Here at Workplace Peace Institute, we're really singularly focused on supporting leaders in creating workplace cultures where everyone can thrive. So to get started talking about restorative justice in the workplace, I want to start off talking about conflict, really grounding our understanding of restorative justice in the workplace within the context of the amount of conflict that we're experiencing and how traditional approaches to conflict resolution aren't really supporting us in experiencing our potential in the workplace or really experiencing our ability to thrive in the workplace. So to get started, let's talk about what's happening in our workplaces. How much conflict are we really experiencing? The most comprehensive research study about conflict in the workplace was actually published in 2008. So the data that I'm going to share with you on the next coming slides is outdated, and I suspect that conditions have actually gotten a little bit worse as it relates to conflict in the workplace. So I do want to encourage you to come to our website, workplacepeaceinstitute.com, and participate in the study that we are doing. We're really wanting to bring some new data to the to workplaces and to individuals that work in conflict resolution. So workplacepeaceinstitute.com, and then you can take our State of Conflict in the Workplace study to help us bring some new data to those of us who are following this work. But the study that was produced in 2008, again, I suspect there's a bit more conflict in the workplace now than then, shows us that 49% of conflict in the workplace is really caused by warring egos. So I think about this from the perspective of identity conflicts. The aspects of ourselves that really resonate with what is important for us in the workplace, how we experience our worth and value is in conflict with how other people maybe see us, or maybe we're competing in the workplace for recognition. 34% of conflict is just caused by workplace stress in general, and 34% of conflict is caused by heavy workloads. We can also see that there is conflict associated with discrimination, the perceived discrimination and actual discrimination, what people define as poor leadership, lack of honesty and openness in the workplace, poor line management, lack of role clarity, lack of accountability, people having just clashes of values, values that shape and inform our work and our behavior in the workplace are clashing with what the values are that are shaping other people's approaches to work. And this really points to either a lack of alignment around corporate values or actually a lack of corporate values that people feel really connected to and can resonate with. We also see conflict around poor performance management, and bullying and harassment are other forms of conflict that we see in the workplace. So how much conflict exists in the workplace? I always get a little bit of an internal giggle around the statistic of 85% of us are dealing with conflict on some level, because I would venture to guess 100% of us are dealing with conflict on some level. That 85% might be conflict that people recognize as discomfort or uncomfortable conflict, but conflict is an inherent part of the human experience, and we're all experiencing conflict. If you are working in an environment that seems to be purely harmonious, that there's absolutely no conflict at place, there's probably high levels of conflict avoidance, if people were really, to be honest about it. And then 29% of people claim that they deal with conflict almost constantly. That almost constant having to engage with and navigate and deal with conflict can be very physically, psychologically, emotionally, even spiritually draining for us. So what is the human cost of conflict? 27% of employees have experienced personal insults or attacks, and 25% of employees say they have seen conflict lead to sickness or absence. That sickness piece, I think, is important to highlight. When we are experiencing constant and chronic conflict, it's actually raising the level of cortisol that's in our system. And what we know about too much cortisol in the system, it causes inflammation. And that inflammation is at the root of many chronic and ongoing diseases. And so this conflict in the workplace really has a deep human impact on us, and that impact can last even longer than the conflict itself. So when conflicts are not addressed effectively, emotions can run high and people really suffer. And it's that human suffering that exists in the workplace that is really a motivator for me as a peace builder, to support people in reducing human suffering and to create workplace environments where we really are able to experience our inherent worth and value as human beings and as workplace contributors. And I think restorative justice really offers a beautiful framework for us to use to navigate conflict in a way where we're able to harness the benefits of it. So conflict is also quite costly. According to this research from 2008, U.S. employees spend 2.8 hours a week involved in conflict. And when you think about that 2.8 hours a week over the course of a year, that is a significant amount of time that people are taking away from their workplace responsibilities, taking away from their creativity, from their innovation, from their productivity, from really being able to lean into what they're here in the workplace to contribute, to just dealing with conflict. So over the course of a year, that results in 18 full work days dedicated to nothing but engaging in conflict. So you can do the math and just kind of like calculate your own salary, and you can see how expensive this actually is to an organization, and why we really need to think about how we can infuse conflict resolution systems into our work environments that helps us to transcend and heal from the injury of conflict, but to really grow and connect as human beings. So I believe very strongly that conflict interventions shouldn't be designed to just get through a particular conflict, but they should be designed to reduce harm in the workplace. So as I said a few minutes ago, conflict is an inherent aspect of the human condition. Because we are humans, we're going to clash with each other. To avoid that would be to avoid just something that's kind of critical to our nature. But those clashes that we have don't have to be destructive. In fact, they can be constructive. So our ability to navigate conflict with dignity is something that we don't have like a lot of formal training around. And I think restorative justice offers a framework for cultivating human security and the dignity as we work collaboratively to transcend workplace conflict. So all of the work that we do here at Workplace Peace Institute is really grounded in basic human needs. And the basic human needs framework that we follow is not the framework that many of us have seen around Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We don't think that basic human needs are hierarchical. In fact, we all have a core set of basic human needs that we are constantly, constantly seeking to achieve simultaneously. So they're not hierarchical. I don't need shelter before I need belonging. I need shelter and belonging simultaneously. So we need conflict resolution systems that are really grounded in basic human needs. So let's take a look at what these basic human needs are. This work is a framework that I've developed, but it's really grounded in a lot of research conducted by John Burton, who was an international relations conflict resolution scholar and practitioner from the 60s, and Dr. Donna Hicks, who actually was a student of John Burton's and is now a professor at Harvard. And she has really done the most extensive research and in-the-field work around dignity. So dignity, I believe, is our most essential basic human need. Dignity is our inherent worth and value. So because we're humans, we have dignity. Because we're humans, we have worth and value. But we don't really have this inherent ability to know how to honor our worth and value. So what Dr. Hicks discovered is that there are some essential elements to dignity that are really critical. When we experience these essential elements, that experience helps us to really have the full embracing of our worth and value. So one is our identity, having our identity honored and fully embraced. So all aspects of who I am as an individual is fully embraced in the workplace. And that's a little bit of a shift than what most of us have been conditioned. Many of us been conditioned into this idea that we need to embrace tolerance, that we need to tolerate differences. And I truly can't think of anything worse than being tolerated. Many of us can think about times in our life where our presence or our ideas or aspects that are really important to who we are as an individual was tolerated. And it's not an experience that leads us to belonging. So we need to have all aspects of who we are fully embraced and fully honored in the workplace. We need to have inclusion. We need to be acknowledged. So acknowledgement and recognition are different, but they go together. Acknowledgement in the workplace is, I see what you did. I see this contribution. I can name it. And I'm going to give you feedback around it. So the feedback is the recognition piece. I see the contribution. I can name specifically what it is. And I care enough about you as a human being to give you feedback around that contribution so that you feel affirmed in what you did. And you also have feedback to support you in growing your skills and growing your ability to really contribute. So that recognition is really critical to the acknowledgement piece. We also need fairness. We need to know that we're being treated with fairness and impartiality. We need to be given the benefit of the doubt. We all have a deep desire to experience the benefit of the doubt. We all experience this visceral response when we know we haven't been given the benefit of the doubt, and yet we're not as good at naturally extending that benefit of the doubt to others. So that's a really important part of us being able to experience our inherent worth and value as humans. We need to experience understanding, and we need to be able to work independently. In my own research, I have found that there is a pathway to this independence. I need my identity honored. I need my contributions acknowledged. I need feedback so that I can improve my contribution. I need to be treated fairly and given the benefit of the doubt so that I can work independently. But a demand to work independently without all those other aspects of dignity being embedded in that process can lead to us having experiences of alienation and a lack of psychological safety. Also, core to our ability to experience our inherent worth and value is accountability, to be accountable to our actions and to be accountable to one another. But the caveat there is that all these other aspects have to be in place. If we are demanding accountability, but we're not creating psychological safety, and we're not creating an environment where people feel their inherent worth and value, then accountability can really be weaponized against us. So we need to know that it's safe to really lean into this essential element of dignity. So I believe our most essential basic human need is the actualization of all of these essential elements of dignity. And we also need some other basic human needs. We need to experience love. We need to know that those that are working with us in our workplace community have genuinely are willing good intentions to us, that we can trust that they really want the best from us. We need to have self-esteem. We need to feel good about ourselves in the work environment. We need to feel affirmed in the workplace. And we need personal fulfillment. I need for my contributions to the work environment to actually affirm who I am, for my gifts to be honored and recognized and appreciated. I need to feel fulfilled in my work. We need justice. We're going to really dig into justice in the next coming slides as we talk about restorative justice. So we need justice in the workplace. We need to experience both physical safety and psychological safety. And I think for many of us, this physical safety was something that we had always, in recent years, in recent decades, could pretty much trust was going to be the case. But I do think in recent years, our world has become a bit more destabilized, and our ability to trust our physical safety in the workplace is not quite as guaranteed. We also need psychological safety. We need to know that we can lean into our relationships, we can contribute without any fear of retribution or humiliation or punishment for being vulnerable and for leaning into our desire to contribute to the workplace. We need belonging. So we also often think about belonging and inclusion as a bit of the same, but there is a power dynamic in inclusion that I want to highlight. If someone has the power to include me, then they also have the power to exclude me. So with inclusion, there's this power dynamic that that kind of unconsciously or with unwritten rules says you have to behave in a certain way in order for this inclusion to happen. So we've all heard the saying that diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is being invited to dance. And you can hear in that definition that there's a power dynamic. Someone is doing the including, which means someone can do the uninviting. Belonging takes it to a deeper level. Belonging is co-creating of community. I have a seat at the table because the table belongs to us all. I am invited to the dance because the dance was created by us all. So belonging is a higher level need that I think is really the goal that we should be prioritizing in this work around basic human needs and dignity, and certainly within the concept of restorative justice. We all need to experience freedom, and we need to experience cultural security. Lastly is we need participation. We need to be full participants in our workplace as well as in our conflict resolution systems. So I offer this to you as a framework for really understanding human dynamics and for you to really contemplate each aspect of these basic human needs and dignity needs from the perspective of proficiency in the dynamics of human behavior and how we need to really be prioritizing the actualization of all of these needs in our conflict resolution systems. And restorative justice offers a really lovely framework for this to happen. So let's take a look at restorative justice with that intro. So in the restorative justice community, there's a lot of conversation and dialogue around what restorative justice actually means as an operating definition. So I am going to offer you what it means for me. So this is the definition and framework of restorative justice that we use at Workplace Peace Institute. It is not the definition of restorative justice in terms of what are we restoring and what is justice. So from our perspective, what we are restoring is as much normalcy as possible. We are restoring our basic human needs and our dignity needs into an actualized reality. So when harm has been done, you can't undo it. There is, if I have been bullied in the workplace, if I have been discriminated against in the workplace, you cannot undo that. It happened. But we can restore as much normalcy as possible, and we can restore conditions in which these basic human needs and dignity needs are met. And that might mean we're not really restoring because perhaps they never existed. But in restoring as much normalcy as possible, we may be embedding new systems where these basic human needs and dignity needs can be actualized. So what is justice? I believe that justice exists when we all have access to the resources necessary to achieve our potential. So I'm going to repeat that. Justice exists when we all have access to the resources necessary to achieve our potential. And inside of that definition is that we all have access. So that means that we're able to hold space for those individuals who are perpetuating harm, have a right to have access to the resources necessary to achieve their potential. Because in achieving their potential, they learn how to be in right relationship with others. And those of us who have been harmed need access to the resources necessary to achieve our potential. And through the process of being harmed, what is necessary to achieve potential may have shifted and evolved. So in order for us to achieve justice, we have to be able to look at this at a very individualized level and think about how we're creating a workplace system that allows for every individual inside that system to have access to the resources necessary to achieve their potential. So I want you to hold those two definitions as we think about what restorative justice is. We are restoring as much normalcy as possible by creating the conditions in which our basic human needs and dignity needs are actualized and experienced so that we all will be able to access the resources that we need to achieve our potential. So ultimately, restorative justice is about the restoration of right relationships. It's a system in which accountability equates to putting right a wrong. And that's a pretty different framework than what we have thought about justice in the past, where justice is, where accountability equates to a person getting what they deserve, some form of punishment. So as we restore right relationships, there's this question around accountability and who's responsible for putting right or wrong. In a restorative justice process, the justice process is expanded to all stakeholders. That's another big shift from traditional justice, where someone has been harmed. They take that complaint to someone who holds power. That person who holds power sort of now becomes the owner of that complaint, and then they enact some form of punishment on the guilty party. So in restorative justice, we're expanding the stakeholder group to every single person who has been impacted by it. The person who has been harmed is at the center of the justice process. So if you think about this from a criminal justice perspective, we are accustomed to the state or the city, the governing entity being at the center of the justice process. In a restore or inside of a work environment, perhaps it is the organization or legal counsel or human rights who's at the center of the justice process. But in restorative justice, the person who's been harmed is centered in that process. The needs of all stakeholders are attended to. So every person who has been impacted by an injurious event, their needs are acknowledged, recognized, and tended to in this process. A restorative justice process acknowledges and addresses the psychological wounds of all the stakeholders, and we recognize trauma and we address that trauma. So restorative justice is a response to harm that centers the needs of the individuals most directly affected by an injurious event, and it creates the opportunity to be indirectly involved in responding to the harm. So at its core, it's a victim-centered process. So what restorative justice is not, it is not actually a specific program. There is not this is the restorative justice program, but rather it is a framework to design a program around. So therefore, restorative justice is not mediation, though mediation may be a tool used inside of the restorative justice framework. It isn't primarily concerned with forgiveness and reconciliation. So oftentimes when we think about restorative justice, we're thinking about it as a process to achieve forgiveness. Forgiveness and reconciliation is often an outcome of the process, but it isn't designed to get us to that point. It's also not designed to reduce offenses, to reduce repeat offenses, although it does often have that consequence, because restorative justice offers this framework for everyone to have access to the resources necessary to achieve their potential. In doing that, it is addressing the central kind of elements that are leading us to behaviors that harm. So while it's not designed to reduce repeat offenses, that it is often the outcome of a restorative justice process. It is not intended for only minor offenses or first-time offenders. So because restorative justice has such a focus on repairing harm and offender accountability and that definition of justice that I have talked about, and it doesn't prioritize or focus on punishment, there can be a tendency for people to think it should only be used for small offenses. It is a very powerful framework for some of the most difficult offenses because of the way that it creates opportunity for pretty radical transformation. Restorative justice is not a replacement for punitive accounts, for punitive accountability, though. So it doesn't prioritize. It's the focus of restorative justice is not on punishment, but that doesn't mean that a part of the accountability may hold some logical consequences to it. So I want to invite you to think about restorative justice as a compass, but not as a specific roadmap. So it's a compass for you to build your own roadmap on, but it's not a roadmap that's sort of like, in the can that can be handed to you. So there's 3 guiding principles for restorative justice that all restorative interventions should hold. One is that harm is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. So if you think about this from a criminal justice perspective, we could say that crime is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. If we think about this in the context of the workplace, we might say that policy violations, or maybe even crime, is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. So where there has been a breaking away of social norms that leads to harm, we understand that as a violation of people and relationships. Those violations create obligations, and the central obligation is to put right the wrong. So these are going to be the 3 principles that all restorative interventions should live up to. There's 3 pillars that are a part of any restorative process. One is that there are harms, and those harms come with particular needs. Those needs produce obligations, and in order for those harms and needs to be addressed through the obligation, there's some form of engagement that needs to happen, meaning the person who's been harmed and the person responsible are going to come together in some way to address this and put right the relationship. So let's first look at pillar 1, harms and needs. Injurious events, so policy violations, crimes, breaking of the law, discrimination, harassment, bullying. These things harm people and they harm relationships. So the goal is that some experience is provided for healing for all people who have been a part of that process, either directly or indirectly. The next pillar is obligation. So when there has been some form of wrongdoing that has resulted in a harm, that creates an obligation. And the goal is that all people responsible for causing harm are given the opportunity to repair the harm. I think that sounds like an obvious thing, but most of our traditional approaches to wrongdoing actually don't create that opportunity for the person who did the harm to actually play a part in repairing the harm. The systems in place are prioritizing punishing that person, not creating opportunity for the person to put right the situation. So restorative justice is very radically different in that way. The third pillar is that there is some form of engagement that brings people together. So all stakeholders are provided the information they need and the opportunity to contribute to their role in the justice process. So the goal is that there is an involvement of an enlarged circle of people. That's going to include the person who was harmed and their community, the person who caused the harm and their community. So that could be a small group or that could be a pretty large group depending on the type of injurious event that occurred. So there's also 6 values associated with restorative justice. These values should really shape and inform any type of restorative justice intervention. So the first is that restorative justice is more concerned with the restoration of the person who was harmed and their community than it is with the punishment of the offender. So value number 1 is also radical shift from what we're used to thinking about from a traditional justice process. So we want to create restoration for the harmed person as our first value. The second is that that we elevate the importance of the harmed party through increased involvement, input, and services. So rather than saying, I receive your grievance or your complaint, and I am now going to take on a process, we say, I have received your grievance and your complaint, and I'm going to involve you very deeply in the process of repair. The third value is that restorative is that it requires the person who's responsible for the harm to be held directly accountable to the person and the community they harmed. So the person harmed is really involved in this process rather than sitting on the sideline waiting for their guilty verdict and their punishment. So it brings these stakeholders together in some form of engagement. The fourth value is that restorative justice encourages whole community to be involved in holding the person who did the harm accountable and promoting a healing environment. So let's say this is in the workplace and there is someone who is responsible for harm in a team environment. That whole team is going to come together in a process of holding them accountable. And accountability looks like opportunity to repair harm so that we can experience healing at an individual level, but also at a collective level. The fifth value is that there is an emphasis on the offender accepting responsibility for their behavior and making amends. So the focus is on acceptance of responsibility and repair. The focus is not on punishment. Now, some form of responsibility may include a logical consequence that is punitive in nature because that's a logical consequence, but the focus isn't on punishment, it's on responsibility and repair. And then lastly, restorative justice recognizes a community responsibility for social conditions to offending behavior. So this is where my work as an organization systems design consultant really comes into play. What is happening inside the whole of the organizational system that is allowing or fostering conditions for what I would just call antisocial behaviors to be cultivated, fostered, and perpetuated. So there's something in the system that is allowing this behavior to surface, and so we need the whole system to take some responsibility for that. So let's look at the goals of restorative justice and some guiding questions that we should be using when we think about a intervention that is restorative in nature. So goal number one is that we put key decisions in the hands of those most affected by harm. So when we think about repairing harm, only the person who has been harmed holds the information necessary to repair the harm. And it's going to be different for every person. So a very easy example that I often provide is if my house was broken into and our TV was stolen, what I would need to repair harm is I would need conditions to be in place that allowed me to feel physically safe in my home again. It would have nothing to do with the TV. It would be about my physical and psychological safety inside my home. My husband would need a new TV. So repairing harm for him is going to be about replacing the material goods that were taken. Very likely if someone broke into our home and took the TV, it wouldn't rock his sense of safety in the world, but it would rock my sense of safety in the world. And everyone listening to this would have their own response to what got broken in that process. So the goal is for the person harmed to make those determinations around what's necessary for repair. The second goal is that justice creates a healing process, that there is healing that is taking place as a result. I am going to get to the end of this process with the experience, or at least the potential for healing to have occurred, meaning this intervention is allowing me to transcend the conflict itself. And it's going to reduce the likelihood of a future offense because it was a healing process. So that means that the person who's responsible for the harm, we have had some kind of a process that has surfaced for that person, why they're behaving, why they're showing up the way they're showing up, why they're behaving the way that they're behaving, and creating the conditions so that that behavior is changed. Going back to the definition of justice, that we all have access to the resources necessary to achieve our potential. So when I have that access to achieving my potential, I'm very likely to not offend again because I am a changed person. So a restorative justice process asks some pretty specific questions. Who has been hurt? What are their needs? Who is obligated to meet these needs? Who has a stake in the situation besides just those two people, or is it just those two people? What is the appropriate process to use in an effort to put things right? So 5 really critical questions that we should be asking ourselves every time we think about a restorative process that we're going to design some kind of intervention to address this harm. So let's take a look at a traditional approach to wrongdoing versus a restorative justice approach. In a traditional justice approach, we say harm is a violation of policy or it's a violation of laws. So crime is a violation of laws, or harm in the workplace is a violation of a workplace policy or law. These violations create guilt, and justice requires the governing authority to determine blame and impose a punishment. So in the workplace, harm has been done, that we recognize that harm because it's a violation of policy or it's a violation of a law, and we make a determination through an investigation if a person is guilty of that. And once we make this determination that they're guilty, we make a determination about what their punishment is. So the offender ultimately gets what they deserve. They get punishment. And in many of our workplace systems and in our social systems, those people who hold a lot of privilege are often not held accountable because the system is designed to protect them for whatever reason. They're too valuable. They're too valuable in terms of like the money that they bring to the organization. So if we think about this inside of a for-profit organization, a person who is in sales or maybe a CEO or someone who's high in the organization, it would do harm to the organization if this person was held accountable. So this system doesn't hold them accountable, and they don't have the process of justice that they need, which means their dignity is not being honored, because accountability is a really critical part to our ability to experience our inherent worth and value. So this traditional justice system often protects those with a lot of power because the system itself is at risk if this person is punished. So you can see how a traditional justice system can, in and of itself, create dignity violations in the workplace. But a restorative justice perspective is a whole different view. And in this perspective, we go, harm is a violation of people in relationships. That violation creates an obligation. And justice is designed to put things right, to restore right relationship. And this involves everybody who has been a part of it. So the central focus is that those people who have been harmed, their needs are really central to a justice process, and the person who has done the harm is responsible for repairing it. So it's a completely different view that allows even people who hold a lot of power to go through a transformative experience of growth. My experience as a human being working with people in all types of harm. So I have worked with people who have perpetuated genocide and people who have been victims of genocide. I have worked with people in prison systems who have committed murder. I have worked with people who are bullies in the workplace. And with very few exceptions, my experience has taught me is that most people do not want to do harm. They are not inherently bad. Something in their society, something in their system, the things that they've been cultivated in have harmed them. And in response, they are perpetuating harm. And restorative justice creates this framework for the potential of healing, and that healing process prevents future harm. And so it's really benefits everyone when those people who have been harmed are able to heal, because the perpetuation of violence has the opportunity to stop, and people have the opportunity to grow and be and do better. There's three different questions that this traditional justice and restorative justice asks. So a traditional justice system says what policies or law was broken, who did it, and what do they deserve. Restorative justice says who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these. So it's a really radical shift in the questions that we're asking, and therefore the intervention that we are designing. So it's really a new framework for perceiving and achieving justice. So in a restorative justice process, there is this expanded stakeholder group. What we are accustomed to is, and so let's put this in the context of work, that there is a person who was harmed and the person who did the harm, and maybe human resources or legal counsel and human resources. In a restorative justice process, we say there is the person who was harmed and their community, the person who is responsible for harm and their community. So that might be two teams or separate groups of people that they work with, the restorative justice facilitator, and we expand the justice process to everyone who has some stakeholder group, some sort of responsibility, or who have been impacted by it. So let's talk about what people who have been harmed really need. They need information. They need to understand the whole context of what happened that led this person to do this thing. So they need as much information as they can possibly get to understand the context. They need truth telling in that process. They need the whole truth, and they need that narrative told in really honest language. And so what I mean by honest language is that the person who is in the truth telling process is using truthful language about what they did, and that they're not using language that separates themselves from this. I will often hear people who have not gone through enough preparation work for a truth-telling process to shift pronouns. So I will be talking about what I did, and then I get to the real core of this truth-telling, and all of a sudden I'm talking about myself in third party. I'm distancing myself from the truth. So victims need to hear the full truth, and they're hearing responsibility and honesty baked into the language that the person is using in that truth-telling process. And they need empowerment. And I think about empowerment as they need the conditions in place to really actualize and experience their full power and their full agency as a human being. The power lives within them, but perhaps conditions have been in place that have not allowed me to fully actualize my power. So we need conditions to be put in place or restored that allows the person who has been harmed to really experience all the power that they hold as a human being. And they need some form of restitution. They need some kind of plan that's putting right the wrong. Very often, what I hear from people is, I want a genuine apology that names what really happened in honest language. And I need to know that this person is going through some form of education, some form of learning and development that's going to prevent this behavior from happening again. So over and over, that's what I hear from people who have been harmed. I want an apology, and I want to know it's not going to happen again, and that the person's doing something to really demonstrate changed behavior. So again, a restorative justice process really centers the need of the person who has been harmed in that justice process. People who are responsible for the wrongdoing, these offenders, they also have some pretty core needs in the justice process. So they need accountability. They need to understand what exactly they did. In this process of justice, there is something that has been designed that is allowing them to come to full awareness with honest language where they can really name precisely what happened. And in doing so, there is this cultivation of empathy, that they begin to feel the severity and the intensity of the impact of their actions, and therefore they take responsibility for it. They do something to repair the harm, and in doing that, there is transformation of shame. So a traditional justice process that prioritizes punishment is prioritizing a person sitting and holding shame. Shame is not the energy of growth. It is not the energy of development, where when I'm sitting in the energy of shame, I'm not learning and I don't know how to do better. So part of accountability is that the person who did this wrongdoing can have the experience of transforming from shame into repair and empathy and wholeness. So they need transformation and healing. They need encouragement to experience personal transformation. And this is often around the enhancement of personal competencies. So when I said earlier that my experience has been that very, very few people intend to do wrong, but they do wrong and they harm people because they don't have the skills to do better. They are doing the best they can do with the skills that they have, and that deficiency is leading to wrongdoing and harm. So part of this transformation and healing process is that they're given, a runway of development. That they're given opportunities and resources for learning, so they can know and do better. So going back to that definition of justice, that they are able to access resources so that they too can achieve their potential. They need support and they need integration from the community. Here in Western culture, we have this idea that if we put this in the context of criminal justice, that you serve your time and you come back to society as a reformed person, free of guilt and shame. In reality, that's not true. People aren't able to integrate back into society. They are forever seen as a perpetrator. So part of the restorative justice process is that the person who is responsible for harm is able to genuinely come back into and integrate into community and be accepted, that they're free of the shame because they've done the work of restoring and repairing harm. Now, that development might take time. It might be a lot of development that needs to happen. And so there may be a need for temporary restraint. I think about this from the context of leadership. If a leader has done harm because they don't have the emotional intelligence skills, or they don't have the cultural intelligence skills, or they don't have the DEI proficiency to lead a diverse team, and so that skills gap is causing them to do harm, well, they may not be ready to be in a leadership position until they develop those skills. So there may be some need for restraint so that the development can happen, so that they're not perpetuating harm in the process of their learning and development so that they can do better. So that need for temporary restraint is not for punishment purposes, but to mitigate ongoing, the risk of ongoing harm. And then community members also have needs. I think about in the workplace environment, our community members are perhaps our team members. They might be our board members. They might be our customers or our stakeholder groups. So our community members need attention to their concerns as victims or their roles as offenders. If you have two team leads that are in conflict with each other, that conflict has rolled down to their teams, and perceptions have rolled down to their teams. And the team members need attention to their concerns, both as victims and offenders. They need opportunities to embrace mutual accountability. Perhaps like, where was I as a team member in just believing the narratives that were told to me, or perpetuating gossip, or participating in bullying behavior because my leader was doing that. So they need to have opportunities for accountability, and they need conditions that are going to promote healthy communities. So that might also be around, what do we need to do in terms of culture development to ensure that we are eliminating whatever was surfacing in our culture that was allowing this behavior to develop and perpetuate. So there's some elements to a restorative justice process that are really important, that need to be in place in order for us to really name a process as restorative. All parties with a stake in the resolution need to be included in the justice process. The process needs to recognize and seek to address the harms that were done to one another. And very critically, it needs to be voluntary. This voluntary nature means we probably can't have only a restorative justice process. You may need a traditional process if the stakeholders aren't willing to participate voluntarily. We're going to talk a minute about what kind of like partial voluntary process might look like. It needs to be premised on and include truth-telling. It needs to be an encounter. In some way, we are bringing the person who has been harmed and the person responsible for harm together in some kind of encounter. Therefore, it needs to also be designed with physical and psychological safety as a central element to it. We need to protect the rights of the person who's been harmed, as well as the rights of the person who is responsible for that harm. It involves a facilitator who has the capacity to hold and ensure a broader social perspective. This facilitator needs to be very proficient in the dynamics of human behavior, and very likely needs to have high proficiency in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practices. There needs to be a plan for the future or an agreement for resolution. So the design of the process needs to be leading us to some form of restitution. It shouldn't focus on punishment, and it should be evaluated by its results. So does it actually restore or not? Is it truly restorative? So that leads me to this final slide of talking about restorative justice, which is the degrees of a restorative justice process. So when we think about the pillars, the principles, the pillars, the values, and the elements of restorative justice, think about it through the lens of, is it fully restorative, meaning it is 100% accomplishing all of these things? Is it mostly restorative? So that might be that there is the victim, the offender maybe is going through a process of repair and accountability, but for whatever reason, the victim isn't participating. So perhaps you have a proxy victim, meaning someone who has had a similar bullying experience that is coming and sharing the stories of what it was like to be bullied. So maybe it isn't possible for the person who was harmed to be there, but we've designed in some way for that offender to have that experience, or vice versa, that the person who was harmed is having some experience of having information and truth telling and accountability as a part of it. So is it mostly restorative? And then is it partially restorative? If you aren't even at the partially restorative piece, then you need to really examine whether a restorative justice process is viable for your particular circumstance. So here at Workplace Peace Institute, we have a full course on restorative justice. It is a 9-hour self-paced online course that you can take to really grow and develop some proficiency in restorative justice. It's interactive from the perspective of it gives you assignments to go put into place and then to come back and get feedback on. So this is a really great course for people who want to learn more about really becoming a facilitator in restorative justice. We also have customized workshops that we can put together and restorative justice consulting, as well as we can come and do an intervention for your organization. If you want to become a restorative justice facilitator, there are competencies that you really need to develop. One being high dignity intelligence. So I want to encourage you to take our 6-hour online course on dignity intelligence. This is self-paced and will really help you in growing those competencies and practices associated with your capacity to be able to, in all circumstances, honor the inherent worth and value of others. And I think that restorative justice facilitators need to be trauma informed. We need to be able to recognize trauma, address it, and attend to it in both real time, but also in conflict intervention design, and maybe also in the restitution planning. So these are just a few of the courses that I think would be really helpful for you. But we have a series of conflict resolution courses that will support you in your conflict engagement design. And we have DEI courses that will also be very helpful for you as a conflict engager. And then I also really want to recommend that people check out the Mindful Leadership course to help you in really growing your capacity for holding spaces of compassion as you do conflict intervention work. So you can learn more about all of these courses at workplacepeaceinstitute.com/leadership-academy. And you can also click on the Contact Us page to reach out to us for more information. So thank you so much for your participation today. I hope that you found this information helpful, and I hope that it's really given you some information to begin to really rethink your own approaches to harm and wrongdoing in your personal life as well as in your professional life.